Hi, I'm Nick.
And I'm Helena, and we both work at the MS Trust, a UK charity for people affected by MS. We're here to help you make sense of MS.
This week, we are going to be talking to potentially a newer audience as well as our loyal audience as well. And we're going to be talking to people who might be a little bit worried that they may have MS.
But for you people who are already diagnosed, please don't turn off. We're going to be sharing an interesting personal story from Dr. Daniel Matheson, more known as the MS Doctor on Instagram. And he will chat to us about his diagnosis, share some tips about what you can do if you're worried that you have MS, and how things are now. So please stay tuned for him later on.
But for now, let's talk about life pre-diagnosis. And we know from the MS Trust, from our helpline and inquiry service, so many people get in contact with us who are worried that they have MS. And maybe you are someone in that situation. Maybe someone you know might be. So perhaps you might have looked MS up on the internet. You might have read about all the symptoms, and they could be sounding like the ones that you're experiencing. Perhaps someone in your family might have MS and you're concerned that there could be a family link too. And you might be concerned that the symptoms that you have are MS.
It's just important to point out that myself and Nick, we're not health professionals, so we'll try and point you in the right direction on where to go and who to ask if this is something that you worry about.
As we know, there's a wide range of possible symptoms that could be associated with MS, but most people will only experience a small number of these symptoms around the time of their diagnosis, and many won't go on to experience every single symptom of MS. Some common early signs are fatigue, which is that kind of exhaustion which is completely out of proportion with the task undertaken. Stumbling more than before. Some people liken that to kind of maybe people might think that you might have been drinking or something. That's often something that we hear that people report to our inquiry service. So stumbling more than usual. Unusual feelings on the skin. So you might have things like pins and needles and numbness. Slowed thinking. And again, this is more so than usual. And problems with your eyesight. Of course, there are lots of other symptoms too, but these are some of the most commonly reported symptoms that people experience around that diagnosis time. All of these early symptoms can also be symptoms of other medical conditions too. So please don't listen to this and think, right, well, I've had some slowed thinking and some problems with my eyesight, so I must have MS. If you are worried that you have MS, it's important that you get in contact with a health professional so that you can get the correct diagnosis. And we'll be talking later to the MS doctor, to Dr. Daniel Matheson, and he lays out some really good plans in ways that you can do that, so that you make sure that your voice is heard and that you can get through to have the correct test done. Saying that, there is no definitive test for MS around the time of diagnosis. The diagnosis will involve considering all of the various symptoms, your family situation, and ruling out other explanations as well.
Yeah, sadly, there's not just like a blood test that you could have to find out whether you have MS or not. So there'll be a few tests and checks that the doctors will want to do. And it can be a pretty lengthy process. We've heard of people who it's been taking years for diagnose, although encouragingly, it seems to be a bit faster these days. My own MS diagnosis came about 9 months after my symptoms started being investigated, but that's by no means any sort of norm of how long it takes. It could be longer, it could be shorter.
Yeah, and going through that experience, Helena, who would you recommend people get in contact with first if they're worried about this?
Well, I think your first point of call should always be your GP to talk about the symptoms that you're experiencing. The GP cannot make a diagnosis of MS, but it can access your symptoms and rule out alternative conditions that could be causing your symptoms. For instance, I went because I had lots of strange sensations going on And I had weird feelings that cold was feeling warm and warm was feeling cold. So the GP, he sort of looked at me and he just sort of wanted to send me up to the A&E for a checkup because he just couldn't make sense of what was going on. But in other cases, the GP might not sort of send you to A&E. He would rather make a sort of referral to, say, see a neurologist or other types of specialists. So if a GP cannot rule out MS after the tests that they've done themselves, they make a referral to an appropriate specialist. I mentioned a neurologist. That's someone who specializes in nervous systems disorders, including MS. Although not all neurologists are specialists in MS in particular. If your GP does not think that your symptoms are due to multiple sclerosis, they might refer you to another specialist if they think that that's more appropriate.
There's so much information that you can use on our website about the diagnosis pathways and how these usually work. So please do have a look in our show notes for more information. Helena, I don't know if you're anything like me, but whenever I kind of experience something that I'm a bit worried about in terms of my health, I will often jump onto Google, type in these symptoms, or look on social media and see what's going on there.
Yeah,
Potentially not the best approach, I guess. Have you
no.
got any thoughts on that?
Well, it can be quite scary, can't it, when you go on Google? I know I have, even post my MS diagnosis, kind of asked about if there's been some niggles and pains and things, and come up with all kinds of really scary scenarios. And I think back in the day when I was diagnosed, I mean, I've had MS for over 15 years. We still had Google back in those days. Was it black and white back in those days? I don't remember, but but I mean, I was plowing through the internet and looking for odd symptoms myself, and I think I was, you end up wanting to almost diagnose yourself with all kinds of strange kind of conditions. And I, like we sort of hinted at, it's not always the best route to go down. We also fully understand it's really hard to see your GP at the moment. You might have to wait a really long time. So then it's really easy to jump online, but it can be really bad for your mental health. We do see a huge amount of people who join our MS Trust Facebook group or send the MS Trust messages via, all the social media channels we have, or emails, or via the website, asking if their symptoms sounds like MS. And there's so many different symptoms that can be MS, so it can be very tricky. And obviously, we can't diagnose you from reading a list of symptoms, no more than what we said your GP can. You really need to go through all these tests and things from specialists. And there are also so many symptoms that sound like they could be MS, but they might have nothing to do with MS at all. So the best thing to do is to keep on trying to get an appointment with your GP so you can sort of get the ball rolling. I also think going online and asking other people, that was something I did. I joined some forums back in those days because I think we were almost pre-Facebook. And it's so easy to sort of jump on those things and almost ask people with MS to help you diagnose you. And a lot of people will sort of say, oh yeah, that sounds like me. But by no means does that mean that you have MS either. Even if it does sound like it could be likely, you still, you just have to be patient and wait, even though it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. It's so easy to do that, isn't it? To listen to people on the internet who are, with the best will in the world, they're trying to offer you their advice. But it's so important, isn't it, to make sure you get that expert advice around your health, especially. We've been having a little chat, I guess, about what you might be going through if you're worried that your symptoms might be MS. We're going to jump into our interview with Dr. Daniel Mattison, who you might know as the MS doctor. He's also someone who lives with MS himself. But we will be back after the interview, and we're going to discuss a few top tips on what to do and around your appointments with your health professionals, and also how to cope with that uncertainty around that early diagnosis, pre-diagnosis phase of the MS journey. So let's jump into our interview. So hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're joined by a guest. So I was wondering, would you be able to just introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, hi guys. So my name's Daniel. I am an MS sufferer and a doctor, so that's quite a unique perspective. Hopefully, I can shed some light from that kind of angle as well here. So
Absolutely. So we're with Dr. Daniel Mattison, and people who have MS, they might have also seen you on Instagram as well, or on social media as is it the MS Doctor?
it is, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I know. We certainly have seen lots of your posts, sort of raising awareness of MS and sort of from your journey from where you were to sort of where you are now. So yeah, that's been amazing.
Yeah, you see, I think it was really the reason I did this was when I was diagnosed, I didn't have anything like this, and I didn't know anybody with MS. I knew nothing about MS, or very little. Um, I felt very isolated, and it was quite scary. So I thought, if I can even just give some people some knowledge in the sense that you're not alone here. And this is a very, I want to say a very common, it is a relatively common disease amongst young people and obviously elderly people as well. But yeah, I just wanted to make everybody realize that there's more out there. Once after diagnosis, you've got a whole life to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that community out there as well, isn't there, for resources or other people raising awareness. So no, that's been really great to see. So yeah, so after your diagnosis, you felt a bit isolated. Is there anything? So obviously today we're looking at people who maybe might be worried that they might have MS or they may be experiencing some symptoms. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you first got diagnosed.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of an anomaly. So what happened was I'm going back 8 years now. Um, I was in my previous career, I was a radiographer, and I got a job in Edinburgh doing the head scans. I was doing neurological research, ironically, and I volunteered for a study as a healthy volunteer. Again, ironically, and this study involved a scan of my brain. So hop on the scanner, and next thing I know, we picked up a lesion. No one knows what's going on. At this time, I had nothing, no major symptoms. I probably had the little niggle, but it was quite easy to put that down to other things. Like I can remember having blurred vision, and I thought I was just tired, doing too many shifts, night shifts, etc. Tingling, numbness, trapped the nerve at the gym, that kind of thing. It was very easy to put these things to another cause. So after I've been on this scanner and we found this lesion, it becomes quite apparent that looking backwards, we've had symptoms that have came and gone and again came and gone, and it was very random. Um, yeah, so a few tests later, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the age of 23.
Yes, yeah, that must have been really difficult time. And it's interesting the way that you say you put your other symptoms down to something else. And I guess a lot of people in that situation might do the same thing. Yeah, you said you might have hurt yourself at the gym, or you had a few vision issues. Maybe it was down to something else. So yeah, I can completely understand that.
Yeah,
And definitely, really lucky, I guess, that you were able to go for that scan in retrospect.
incredibly lucky. I think the strange thing is, a lot of people they present to the GP with very strange symptoms, and there's never an explanation, and it can take years before we actually find out this is multiple sclerosis. Where with me, it was the opposite. Like MS kind of came to find me, if you like, as opposed to me trying to figure out what's giving me all these funny symptoms. So yeah, in hindsight, it was very fortunate. What I've taken from this is what I would advise to other people, and don't ignore symptoms because I did. I had the blurred vision, and it was like, oh, it's fine, it will get better, and it did get better. But that's the nature of MS. You get the peaks and the troughs, and the relapses and the remission. And I'd get a symptom and it would come and it would last about a week and then it would disappear. And then I'd forget about it. And I'd keep living. Very random things, There was times where I couldn't feel my feet and I didn't think anything about it and it just gone. And that was me. I just carried on with life. in hindsight, that was ridiculous because there was obviously something happening to make me lose sensation in both feet. So I just think, yeah, don't ignore these flags, guys, because it could, I'm not saying it will be, but it could be an early sign of MS.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's worth mentioning that just because you're experiencing some of these symptoms, we don't want to scare people and make people think that they have MS. But it's definitely a really good advice not to ignore these symptoms, and particularly if you know, as many of us would do, you know, put them down to something else. You know, they'll come and go. So maybe you might ignore them one day. Particularly, I was just thinking at that sort of young age, you know, when you were diagnosed and stuff, maybe, you know, at that age, you might not think much of it. If you experience some of those symptoms, you might think, oh, lots of people have, you know, loss of sensation in their feet or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, in hindsight, it sounds really strange thinking like that. But yeah, at the time, as a 23-year-old, I the last thing I thought was I've got MS. It didn't bother me in the sense that, you know, I still went to the gym and I still played football, and it didn't affect my day-to-day life other than I'd go to work and be like, my leg's a bit numb today, things like that. So it was very easy to forget it was there and just carry on. But yeah, in hindsight, it does seem a bit silly that I was just ignoring these signs. Yeah.
With a job like yours that must have been quite high pressure and is, you know, still high pressure, maybe you might, you know, the fatigue or the numb legs and things like that. Did you put some of that down to the job, to working every day in the gym and that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. The blurred vision I put down to just I think I'd worked 3 or 4 nights, and it was on a night shift that I'd noticed it, and that was I can remember thinking, you are really tired, you need to go to sleep, and I put it down purely to a lack of sleep. I didn't think for a minute that there could be something neurological going on. Again, I was 23. I was otherwise fit and healthy. I guess I just ignored the red flags, and again, in hindsight, it seemed very silly. But if I took anything from it, it's what I can advise to other people. Don't do that. You know, there's always a reason for a symptom, no matter how obscure. That's what I'd probably say to that.
Obviously, you're working as a junior doctor at the moment in hospitals, but from the point of view of someone who was going to see a GP with some of these symptoms, is there anything that you would advise? We already talked about not ignoring the symptoms, but is there any specific advice that you'd give to people?
Yeah, I think it's important that get a timeline of your symptoms, how long they last, how long they disappear for. And, you know, MS has a very unique pattern in that symptoms are very random. So if you come into a GP and say, one day I've had a numb arm and it back gone after a week, and then my vision went blurry, and then my balance went, that is a pretty clear reason to investigate for MS. I think it's very important to don't be vague when you go to your GP. Give them a really clear story. Just try and write down every symptom you get and how long these symptoms last. That's the advice that I would give, because that gives you a much stronger basis for investigations towards multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, absolutely. We know how stretched a lot of services are at the moment, and how difficult it is sometimes to get that referral or get to see a specialist. So that's really good advice. So you mentioned there sort of writing down the symptoms and how long they last for. And that's often advice that the MS Trust would talk about as well, in terms of keeping a symptom diary. So just make sure that those things are written down. Make sure you, as you were saying, how long these things are lasting for. And then, yeah, so I guess from your side of things, from someone who works as a medical professional, as a health professional, you've got a little bit more to work with, I guess, than if someone came to a GP and was quite vague.
Yeah, so I'd be looking for these pinpoint red flags. So do the symptoms come and go? Are they coming, are they random? Are they affecting different body parts? You know, like things like this would, you know, like I said, if it's affecting different body parts at different times and it's coming and going, I'd be looking for a family history of MS, for example, things like that. All these things are important to take with you to your GP and just lay it all out on the table, and obviously just explain I am very worried that this could be MS. Can I possibly have this investigated, please? And I think that's very important, that a lot of patients don't actually state why they're coming and what they want. And sometimes people are just scared, and it's important to relay that to your GP and get these things ruled out, or, investigated in any way they can.
Yeah, it's definitely can be, as we know, can be a really, really difficult and scary time for lots of people. And that was really interesting. So you said make sure you've got sort of your intention, so what you want to have, what you want the doctor to look at, why you're worried about it, and then also present your symptom diary, your information. And then it was interesting you were saying about sort of family links as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is very likely a genetic component to MS. We know that obviously if your sibling or your first degree relative has MS, you're more likely to have MS. So there is definitely something there. Family history plays into a lot of things, even just autoimmune disease in general. If someone in your family has an autoimmune disease, it's more likely that you're going to be predisposed to an autoimmune disease, albeit it might not be the same one. For instance, my grandmother has lupus. My mother has rheumatoid arthritis, and I've got multiple sclerosis. Is there a link there? Very likely there is, but no one in my family directly has multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting to get that family history as well, and that could also help to paint the whole picture for the health professional to get you that support that you need. Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess if we could move on from there, so from sort of supporting people going through the process of being diagnosed, I was wondering if sort of after you were diagnosed, if you could tell us if you had any support for other people who they've gone to their GP, they were worried about MS, and they got the information looked at and the tests, and then the diagnosis has come back that they are now newly diagnosed with MS.
Yeah. So this is the part that I didn't do very well. I didn't talk to anybody. Again, I didn't know anybody. I got very depressed. So I can tell you what to do or what not to do from experience, because I would advise doing the opposite to what I did. It's important to recognize that you're not alone. That's the first thing. There's a lot of people out there reaching out to, like you said, the MS Trust. There's the MS Society, and Shift.ms is another one. There's so many resources out there. Just talk to people, understand how they've dealt with their diagnosis, or people living with the disease. This is what I'm trying to push on my Instagram, that, the message that I'm ultimately trying to get across is that life doesn't end after diagnosis, because I thought it did, and since I've trained as a doctor, and I'm still pushing this. And I just think you need to really understand that there is so much more after diagnosis, that it's so important, and it's so easy to not appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really clear on your journey on your social media, is that there's so much after MS, and that feeling from when you're going through your early stages through the diagnosis process, is scary, and a lot of people might feel like, this is the start of something really, really difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
For many people it might be.
Yeah.
But there are also people doing lots of amazing things after that diagnosis too.
Of course. And I think this is the sink or swim moment. You decide to, do I sit back and let this consume me, or do I make something good of a bad situation? The way I look at it, and I think this is a really, really good way to look at it, you have a chance now to redefine your life. Yeah. This has come and derailed your life, let's say. So now you've got an opportunity that not many people get. My opportunity was, I'm going to quit my career and I'm going to train to be a doctor. And it changed my life completely. And I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been diagnosed. So I made something good come of something very bad. And I think
Wow.
that everybody needs to do that. Anybody can do it. And I'm not saying, I make it sound really easy. Yes, I'll go to medical school. And anything though, anything you're interested in, learn an instrument or, write a book, just something that you're passionate about. Make your diagnosis. It's already affected your life, so make it good. Make it a good impact. That is my message.
Wow. Yeah. So do you feel it's kind of gave you that push to go and chase something that you wanted to do?
Yes, 100%. I would never have. I had no interest, admittedly, in leaving my career and going to medical school, and I did that because my diagnosis. It was probably seeing the neurologists and things like that. That when I had my exposure, I thought I want to get hands-on with this disease. So I made that choice. Other things. So I've run the Great North Run for MS. I would never have done that pre-diagnosis, so it gives you like a why, if you like. You wake up on a morning, you think, right, why am I doing this? And it always gives you a reason to move forward. And I think
Amazing.
you need to embrace that. You really do. And you need to embrace it from day one. And I know it's easier said than done, and I didn't do it, so I know that I'm kind of arguably being a bit hypocritical here. I learned this late, and I'm trying to help people not make the error I made.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey and very inspirational, and I'm sure it'll touch a lot of people who are listening. And we wouldn't say that's hypocritical at all. It's your experience and you're passing on that knowledge. It's such a difficult time for lots of people. So yeah, absolutely. And in terms of from where you're going now, how could I ask how you sort of balance at the moment your MS symptoms, your treatment, alongside your job at the moment?
Yeah, so this is another good thing about being very open about it. So I get a lot of support from work. So I no longer work night shifts because that would be silly. I can't do that. And you need to recognize your limitations. So that's another, I could talk all day about things like this. But yeah, I don't work nights and I take a Wednesday off every week. That's my choice because I know that if I break my week up, I've got a fighting chance to get through the week. MS is exhausting and you need to know your limits. You need to be realistic, but you can still achieve so much as long as you takes a bit more planning, granted, but it is doable. And it's actually quite exciting when you kind of have a focus,
Definitely. It's really interesting you were saying there about be as open as you can with your employer as well, so you can access that support.
Yes, definitely. I went through this again, going back to what you should not do. I was in my third year of medical school before I told anybody I had MS. I kept it completely secret. And I was making excuses to my friends all the time, like, Dan, can you come out tonight? And I was like, oh no, I don't know, I'd make anything up. But the truth was I was taking my injection and I knew that it was going to make me feel bad for the weekend. And that was every week. So I'd have a different excuse every week. What I should have done is just told everybody, look, guys, I've got multiple sclerosis and bear with me. And that would have been a much easier thing. It's because the stress of lying, is it lying? The stress of covering up the truth is something that you can avoid, and I would advise avoiding that.
Yeah, it's so many people listening to this will have had similar experiences, and as we were saying, it is such a difficult time in someone's life. So of course people are going to do things like that, and of course there will be lots of people who don't feel comfortable sharing that information straight away with other people. But it's really interesting that you've said it's good to talk about MS. It's good to talk about you're worried that you might have MS. Be as open as you can with other people. And actually, it's, as you were saying, not telling people actually became quite stressful for you.
I felt like I was kind of living a lie because behind closed doors, I'm dealing with this, at the time, monster, let's call it. But then I'd be going out in front of my friends and I'd be smiling and I'd be, nobody knew I had MS and I was trying to live this life that I knew wasn't really me. And it's so much more empowering and partly making my Instagrams help me do this as well. Just be so open about who you are because it's nothing to be ashamed of, And that's something I'd really push.
Yeah, absolutely. And that openness and talking about it is so important, isn't it? So from our talk today, if anyone's out there who's worried that they have MS, we talked about keeping a symptom diary, making sure when you go to your health professional, your GP, that you show them your diary, you discuss your symptoms, but also you tell them why you're worried. You're worried because you think that you might have MS, you might have something else, and that you'd like to get someone to look at that, and also talk about your family history in terms of medical conditions as well, and then also to talk about it with other people, to be as open as possible, to access some of that support that's out there, whether that's through the MS Trust or any other organisation, to make sure that you look after yourself and look after your mental health too. But is there anything else that you would suggest doing as sort of a final tip for people who might be worried that they have MS?
Yes, take your medications, because I have a lot of people who've said to me through Instagram, I don't have any symptoms. Should I stop taking my drugs? No, don't do that. So MS is it's a silent disease, it's an invisible disease, and it's a very insidious disease. And what I mean by that is, it is progressing whether you have symptoms or not. So when I had my scan and picked up the lesion, I didn't have any symptoms at that time, but there was disease activity going on. So don't stop taking your medications because you want to, because again, I get it, you want to live a normal life. You've just been diagnosed. Nobody wants to go from a totally healthy person to someone who's dependent on medication. And I was no different. But these medications will change the course of the disease, and they are so important. So get on a drug and stick to the drug.
Yeah, so it's for anyone who's kind of newly diagnosed, not experiencing some of those symptoms, make sure you're taking your meds.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that just because you're not, because again, I had the same thing. Because I had no symptoms, I thought, oh, well, I obviously don't need this drug. And that's, it doesn't work like that. Stick on a drug, stay on it, and it will make the world of difference.
Brilliant.
The major thing here is be open, be honest with yourself. That's the thing. I wasn't, and I ended up depressed. I was living a lie. This MS is nothing to be ashamed of. MS is something that it's actually the most common neurological disease amongst young adults, and it's not easy. So don't deal with it by yourself. Sorry, there's so many resources, there's so many people, and you can make the burden a lot easier on you by just talking to people.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's such good advice, and great to speak to you today. If anyone wanted to find you on social media to follow your journey, where could they find you?
So my Instagram is the MS Doctor. That's the.ms.doctor. And if you've got any questions, please just fire them across in a message. Obviously, nothing that you say, I'm not, it's literally between us, and I will just talk. I can't give any medical advice out over there, obviously, but I'm someone to talk to who's experienced what you're going through. And if you just need to just sound off, it's just someone to speak to.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you very much for having me. Pleasure.
Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here's where there would be an advert. But as we're a charity, we don't do that. So instead, we'd like to take this opportunity to tell you all about our own resources.
So you can head over to our website, mstrust.org.uk, and you can find lots of information about what we're chatting about in this podcast. So please do head to that website and click on MS information and support. There'll be a header there called Worried You Have MS. So click through to that one for all of our resources.
And now we are back. I enjoyed listening to your chat with the MS Doctor. I follow him on Instagram. it was quite a different diagnosis story. I mean, we were saying about how long it could take for some people, and he sort of just more or less got diagnosed without really searching for a diagnosis.
Yeah, it's almost kind of accidentally by the sounds of things. Just that he was in that situation and was able to get that diagnosis. So I appreciate that everyone listening to this probably won't have that similar diagnosis journey. And as you say, Helen, it could take a short period of time. For some people, we know it can take a lot longer.
Yeah. And I think, I've worked for the MS Trust for a long time, and his is one of the few stories I've heard like that. There's also been people who have had to go into hospital for one or another reason and had an MRI scan, and then they've noticed lesions in the brain at the time, and then sort of started investigating MS. And these were people who might not even had very many symptoms. But I would say that's fairly rare. I think most people, it tend to take a little while. But I would like to say, I think that since these 15 years of my diagnosis, I've also seen people getting diagnosed quicker. It's one of those conditions that sometimes it was sort of predominantly women in their, say, 20s to 40s that were diagnosed. But I think with awareness raising and talking about that MS doesn't discriminate, it would be, different race and not just necessarily women or older people or younger people, children get diagnosed. That if you are really worried about your symptoms, don't think just because you don't belong to that sort of bracket that you shouldn't be pushing to ask to be seen.
Yeah, definitely. And it's easy to do that, isn't it? Think that's not something that I could have,
Yeah.
That's not something that I could have. But yeah, do make sure you do get to see a health professional if it is something that you're really, really worrying about.
Yeah. Now, we promised that we were going to get back on giving you some sort of ideas of how to go about doing this. So one thing which I think is really important to prepare for your appointment when you're going to see a GP. As we've said several times, it can be tricky to see the GP. The time is very limited. So to come prepared is really important. So a good thing to do would be to do a symptom diary, so you can really make best use of your appointment that you have. So our website suggests that you note down what symptoms you're experiencing and how long ago they started, how often and when they occur, whether they come and go or if they're more persistent. Some of these like weird sensations that you can have, like pins and needles, I mean, some of it might last constantly, others might come on when there's different things might trigger them, or all that sort of information will help in order to investigate. The severity of the symptoms, this can be a simple scale such as 1 for good days to 5 for bad days. How the symptoms affect your everyday activities, like for instance, if you're experiencing fatigue, can you get on with your work? Are you fine at school? Is it really impacting your daily life? And anything that seems to sort of triggers symptoms that make you feel worse or better. Back in the days when they used to diagnose MS, they used to do something called the hot bath test. Because some MS symptoms can be made worse for not all people with MS, but quite a lot of people with MS, if they're hot. So they would put the person that they suspected had MS in a warm bath, and then sort of after they got out of the bath, they would note to see whether, things like fatigue or were they stumbling more and things like that. They don't do that anymore, but for instance, heat could be such a trigger. It's also worth noting down other health conditions you might have, any medications that you're taking, both prescribed and over the counter. And as Nick talked about before, medical conditions affecting other people of your family. So for instance, is there anybody in your family that have MS or other autoimmune conditions perhaps as well, or any other conditions that potentially it could be instead of MS. So any kind of medical history will be useful.
If you're listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, that's a lot of information to take to that appointment, just collect what you can, and make sure you take it with you, but also have potentially a sort of a brief summary of your diary entries. So that could be just on a single sheet of paper as a list or as a table, and then you could show that to the health professional as an overview and say, on these days my fatigue was a 4. It lasted for this many hours, and it stopped me doing my day-to-day activities. You could always jot it down on your phone as well, so that you've got it handy, and then you don't have to worry about losing that piece of paper. But it's really important that you have that information listed and written down, so that when you get into the appointment, we all know what it's like, don't we, when we go to an appointment about our health, and oftentimes we can forget something, we can underplay things or overplay things sometimes. So just make sure you've got that records, and that it has all of that information that Helena has just mentioned about your whole overall picture of your health at that time. We did also promise you some tips on how to deal with the uncertainty of this stage of your journey, that uncertainty of waiting for your appointment, and the uncertainty of waiting whilst the results come as well, to find out whether or not you have MS or something else.
And as we mentioned before, there's no test that will be able to tell you straight away that you have MS. And you'll be most likely to you'll see a range of health professionals and go for a lot of different tests. And some of these tests will not be for MS, but it will be to exclude other conditions. And this time, that could be very challenging. And, I've heard a lot of people calling it limbo land. But to understand how your journey to diagnosis is going, it might be actually quite helpful during this time. That can be quite stressful. So here are some tips. At the end of the appointment, find out what the next steps will be and what further tests might be tried. And if further appointments are needed, can you ask as well, when do you expect these to happen? Ask to be copied in on to letters between the consultant and your GP. They didn't have it back in the days when I was diagnosed, but like the NHS app, for instance, if you opt into that sort of thing, you quite often get to see the letters and things going in, and I find that can be quite useful. Not all services might not offer this, but if that's a possibility, it's worth asking. And if you don't understand something, ask the health professional to explain, perhaps in a different way. Sometimes when we go to these type of appointments, you can feel really, a bit stupid, maybe because you don't understand. Some health professionals don't speak in a in a language that we always understand, because I don't know. Most GPs are very good at this nowadays, but sometimes you come across these health professionals that speak like they're speaking to another health professionals rather than a patient, and it can be quite tricky to sort of follow along. So if you don't understand, you are not stupid. You ask, please ask, because it's not always easy to follow what they're talking about. And if you're unhappy with the way that the diagnosis is being handled, you can ask your GP to refer you to a different specialist for a second opinion. Although there's no legal right to a second opinion, requests are usually accepted.
Around this time, you might feel stressed or run down. You might feel anxious or depressed from living with these unexplained symptoms. So if this is the case for you, make sure you also talk to your GP about whether or not you can be referred to a counsellor, to help you find ways of living with this uncertainty. It's really important that you don't just suffer in silence. So please do make sure that you reach out for that help.
On that note, it's also important to remember that some of these symptoms can be treated before any diagnosis is confirmed. So talk to your GP what can be done to help you managing the symptoms that you experience now. And that's especially important if it's pain involved or anything like that.
If you do go through this process and then actually the results come back and it isn't MS, what should you do next? This is often a question that the MS Trust gets on their inquiry service and on our helpline. And it's sometimes a question of watching and waiting to see how symptoms develop, as this can also help to distinguish MS from other possibilities. Although this can be really frustrating, and we appreciate that. It can also be worrying, but this is quite a common experience that lots of people go through around this pre-diagnosis or early diagnosis experience. So if your health professionals are unable to give you a diagnosis at the moment, you should be able to agree a plan with them. So, for example, you might agree that a follow-up appointment takes place in 6 months, in a year, but with the option to get in contact with you sooner if you have any significant new symptoms or you become more severely affected. So it's your responsibility to keep pushing for a diagnosis. Keep going, but do that whilst acknowledging that this is not always straightforward. You know, it really isn't. It can take time, and we know that, and the MS community know that. So just keep going and keep prodding, keep finding out what is the next steps for you and your health. Make sure you know which health professional to contact. Make sure you know who you're going to talk to should your symptoms change or should you experience new symptoms. Make sure you mention that in your appointment so that you know what your next steps are.
And I can just share a bit of my own diagnosis process, that when I was starting to experience symptoms, I went for an MRI scan and they noticed some lesions and they said that MS could be a possibility, but they had to wait and see. So it was very much the case of me just having to sort of schedule another appointment. I think they said that they wanted to do an MRI scan in 6 months' time for me, and then see if anything happened. And then I had to do a symptom diary where I would note down anything that was going on in between. There was other symptoms and things happening during that time. So when I came to my appointment 6 months later and I spoke to my neurologist, I could sort of say that, yeah, actually I've been going numb in my hand and this has been happening. And then the scan itself showed that there had been more disease activity, and therefore I got a diagnosis pretty swiftly after that second consultation with the neurologist. So yeah, sometimes it annoyingly is a case of just waiting and see. But if you're listening to this, having gone through this whole process and you did get an MS diagnosis, I would sort of say head to our website for the information directly dedicated for the newly diagnosed, and also have a look out for our next podcast, because that is going to be dealing with the topic of being newly diagnosed.
Yeah, and if you do have any questions about MS, this would be before your diagnosis, after your diagnosis, many years later, do contact our inquiry service or helpline. So we're available from Monday to Friday, apart from UK bank holidays, and that's between 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Outside of these hours, you can, of course, still contact us, but just leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. If you wanted to call the helpline, the service is on the number 0800 032 3839, or you can drop us an email. That's ask@mstrust.org.uk.
And you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. I think we are also now on TikTok. And you can find this podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. If you found this useful, then please share it with your friends and let them know about the MS Trust podcast. Give us a follow, subscribe, so you'll know when the next episode is out. And finally, we would like to say a big thank you to Ant Chapman Audio for the music of this podcast. See you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.